Welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate, and today I'm going to be doing an overview of what I read for one of the readathons that I recently participated in, which was the Once Upon a Readathon, which was created by Hannah over at Hannah Blackwell. I will have her channel linked down below. This was a super fun readathon to participate in. She had really put a lot of work into designing basically a fairy tale for us to play through. And so what I'm going to do is organize this wrap up in terms of the steps that we did for the readathon and which books I read fit which steps. So it'll be kind of an overview of how the readathon went. And happily, the team that I was on, Fairy Godmothers, won the readathon. So go Team Fairy Godmothers. Overall, this was a great reading month for me in terms of number of books. I ended up reading 5 full-length books, 1 novella, and 1 graphic novel. And then I got about halfway through my final book, so I didn't quite finish out the readathon in terms of hitting all of the steps. Because I ended up having to finish that last book in December, but I am going to be talking about it as part of this wrap-up because I didn't want to have to do like a separate review for it. So you will be hearing about all 8 of these books. As part of this fairy tale, the idea was that there was a magical apple tree. I think it promised immortality. I don't remember exactly what the gift was, but the idea was that you were attempting to make your way to the tree and then obtain one of these magical apples. So, the very first step of the readathon was to research the history of the apple tree. The first prompt that I filled for this was to read a retelling, and for that I read Olympus by Rachel Smythe? I'm not exactly sure how you're supposed to pronounce this author's name. This was a Hades and Persephone retelling in a graphic novel format. Like I said, the art for this is absolutely gorgeous. I just really love that, and you get to see Cerberus being a good boy, which of course he is. So what worked really well for me in this one was the artwork. I really loved the style of this. It has very vibrant colors. It is cartoonish, but still in a fun, unique way, so I really enjoyed that side of it. I will admit that I am typically not a Greek myth retelling fan, with the strong exception of the video game Hades, which is absolutely my favorite Greek myth. I don't know, that's kind of retelling, reimagining. This one I struggled with a little bit because I really loved parts of it. Like, I loved that Hades was like this dog dad and it was super adorable. It is in a sort of like, it's taking Hades and Persephone but in a more modern setting, so it was interesting to see that twist on it. But I had the same problem with this that I frequently do with Greek myth retellings, which is that they are often tragic and messy. And while this one, I don't know that it's necessarily going to be tragic, it has some darker content. There is a content warning at the beginning of this. We're saying that Olympus regularly deals with themes of physical and mental abuse, sexual trauma, and toxic relationships. And do not take that content warning lightly if those are things that bother you. I am someone who finds reading about sexual assault when it's depicted exactly to be very difficult. It's not a trigger for me necessarily. It can kind of diminish my enjoyment of a book overall. And unfortunately, that's the case here. Towards the end of this book, the content warning really comes into play, and it is not referenced. It is literally on the page. So again, I should have been paying attention to that content warning. It's not super graphic, but if you are bothered by it, just know that the content warning is there for a reason. And I think kind of in line with that, what I was saying about the content warning is that I don't love reading about toxic relationships, and there are many of them in here. So I think if you're not bothered by things that you do tend to see in Greek myths, like toxic relationships, sexual assault, violence, I think you could really enjoy this, especially if you really dig the art style. It's just ended up being a 3.5-star read for me because I was not as into some of the content, even though I did really like the art. So a bit of a mixed bag for my first book, but I'm glad I finally got around to reading this one. And I do think I will pick up other volumes in that series. I just don't know that it's going to be right away. The next prompt that I filled was for featuring royalty, as well as a title that includes once, upon, a, or time. And you got hard mode for that if you read something that had more than one of those words in the title. And I actually went out looking for a book that would satisfy hard mode, and I found Once More Upon a Time by Roshani Chokshi, which is a novella. It is not really a fantasy retelling. Not really a fairy tale retelling. It incorporates ideas of a fairy tale and really plays with them. So the premise for that one is essentially that you have a prince and princess, and the princess either gets poisoned or gets sick, I don't remember, and the prince makes a deal with a witch that they will forget their love for each other if the witch will save the princess's life. She does so, and then they basically have a year and a day to rediscover their love, or they will have to leave the kingdom that they're living in forever. It's something tied to the kingdom that the people who rule it must be in love or the kingdom is cursed. And this was only, I think it was around 144 pages, and unfortunately this really just didn't work for me. I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. What I did like in this story is that it does do a lot of blending of fairy tale elements. There are some funny sections where you have way of talking animals that Chokshi kind of plays around with and pokes fun at. There were moments that I enjoyed, like discrete scenes that were funny to me and that I had a good time with. But the problem that I have with this one is the exact same problem that I had with Kill the Farm Boy, which is a book I read before I ever had a booktube channel. It was like a year or two ago, I think. And that one is by Delilah Dawson and Kevin Hearn. And it's making fun of something on such a focused level that it's paying too much attention to the jokes and not enough to the story. I don't mind. Obviously, I'm a fan of Discworld. I love humorous SFF, but I need it to have its own story and not to be just constantly like, haha, look how funny that is. That doesn't work for me. I just end up kind of getting annoyed with how on the nose it is. And so that was my problem here as well. It is really making fun of elements from fairy tales, and I just was over it so fast. There's funny scenes, but so much of it is like, yeah, I get it. I get that there's dumb stuff in fairy tales. We can move on now. So, and it wasn't even... Saying it that way makes it seem like I don't think Chokshi has a problem with fairy tales. I think she genuinely enjoys fairy tales. She's just having fun at its expense, which is totally fine. It's just so nonstop that it didn't work for me. I think there are definitely plenty of readers who are going to enjoy this type of over-the-top, funny, very snarky sense of humor regarding fairy tales. So if that sounds like something that would appeal to you and you don't mind stuff that's really on the nose or somewhat heavy in its dealing with humor, then I think you would really enjoy this. So don't let my 2.5 stars dissuade you from reading it, but it just was not my cup of tea. The second step for the readathon was to find your way to the apple tree. The first prompt that I filled for that was a book that has a map, which most fantasies do, so that was not a difficult one to check off. But this was a buddy read that I had suggested to Jake over at the Bookish Drummer as sort of a Patreon pick for his Patreons and patrons. I'm never sure of the terminology there, but I was so excited to finally get to this, and that was The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. This I've had on my shelf since it came out. I think it came out last year, if I remember correctly. Last year or the year before. But this is a humorous fantasy that basically follows the adventures of a thief called Kinch Nashanik. and he basically gets in debt to the Takers Guild that trained him, and ends up having to help out a knight named Galva on this quest that she's going on, with the Takers Guild basically asking him to keep an eye on her for their sakes. And I absolutely adored this. I gave this 4.5 stars, but I rounded up to 5 for Goodreads, and I think it's just going to be a 5 in my head, so I might go back and like bump my rating up a little bit, just because this is honestly a favorite of the year for me. I will say that the experience was probably helped a lot by the audiobook, which is narrated by Buehlman himself. There's also songs. All of the songs that are in here are actually sung, I think, by a friend of Buehlman's. Andrew Sklar is the name of the guy who sings all of the songs, and that just brought such an extra element to me. I had such a good time with listening to the songs. Normally, if I'd just been physically reading this, I probably would have skimmed them. But I think it really added to the atmosphere to have that. Buehlman definitely affects sort of like a ye old Renaissance fair voice, which, like, if you've ever been to a Renaissance fair or a Celtic festival, you're probably well aware that people will adopt this sort of like quasi UK accent, which is kind of like Irish, a bit of Scottish, some English, some Welsh, like it's just a grab bag. And that's definitely what the voice that Buehlman picked up for this reminded me of. And I think that's fitting because I have seen some people talk about the fact that he used to have a show at Ren fairs where he would insult people. And so it's, like I said, it's just, it's perfect to me. And I love the humor in here. Kinch is a bit of an asshole, honestly. He's constantly pushing people's boundaries. He's a bit on the rude side. There's a fair amount of like street slang vulgarity in this, and it got a little bit too much for me in parts. Like the amount of slang for a woman's like genitals was just like, come on, man. Can we move on from this, please? So that was like, that's literally my only gripe about this. I just found him to be sort of in that camp of lovable rogue. And I think to really enjoy this, you need to love Kinch, because the story is told in a sort of almost episodic adventure to adventure type style. And I had such a fun time with it because I just wanted to see what he got into next. But he has a very rambly storytelling style, and he'll kind of randomly mention parts about the world and the way different nations or groups interact, but kind of in an offhand way that he doesn't dive into. So you have to be pretty comfy with just being tossed in and figuring it out as you go. But if you enjoy those sorts of things, I think you might have as much fun as I did with this one. Like I said, it is absolutely a new favorite. I can't wait to pick up any other installments that Buehlman does for this, and I definitely want to check out his horror next, because I had just such a good time with his writing style, even if I assume his horror has a bit less of the humor that I enjoyed so much in this one. The other thing I will mention in this, as like the other gripe that I forgot about, there's a scene that involves a card game that Buehlman has clearly come up with that is fun, and I think if you like Gwent from The Witcher, you might enjoy that scene more than I did. Like, I just don't get that into fantasy, like, in-story games. And so for me, that was kind of like, all right, let's just skip past this part. But again, very few gripes for that book. I had a fantastic time with it. Next prompt for this step that I completed was actually one that fit multiple prompts. I had recently acquired, as well as a cover that has red, orange, yellow, or brown on the cover. And I will show the cover that I have, but I also listened to some of the audio for this, which is has a slightly different cover on it. So this is The Book Eaters by Sunyi Dean. I have the Illumicrate version here, which is actually really cool if anyone wants to check that out. I don't know if you guys will be able to see the edges there. It has a really neat naked hardcover. But anyway, the combo between, I'll put up a picture of the audiobook too, because that's where I got the colors from. My Illumicrate copy is just like silver and black, basically. This one was actually an anticipated read for me. It was one of the most anticipated I was getting from Illumicrate this year, and unfortunately, it didn't quite live up to that for me. I ended up giving this 2 stars, and it's really a mixed bag for me. So the premise for this is that there is a group of people who are kind of living in these secluded manors in the UK, and then I think there's a sense of them being scattered around the world as well. But they are reclusive because they have extra abilities, but they eat by consuming books. And the main character, Devon, ends up giving birth to a son who, instead of eating books, basically survives by eating people's minds. And so it's her attempt to both keep him safe from these secretive families who are a very patriarchal, sort of oppressive society when it comes to women, as well as making sure that he's not going on a rampage and that he's not getting in trouble for essentially lobotomizing people. And I will say this definitely has a feel more of urban fantasy, and that if the draw for you for book eaters is the magic and the book eating aspect, you might come away a little disappointed, because that definitely takes a backseat to some of the thematic exploration of patriarchy and a mother's love for her children. I think that the magic was less than I was expecting it to be. I will say that I liked Devon as a sort of prickly, somewhat unlikable character. She's willing to do basically anything for her son, and she has a view of humans that is not all that caring about what happens to them, because she's too focused on her survival and her son's survival, basically. And she's constantly trying to keep him and herself safe from the family, which is the secretive society of book eaters. I like that Dean didn't try to make Devon likable. I like that she's this representation of a woman who has been mistreated by the society that she grew up in, like all of the women in this group, and how dedicated she is to protecting her son. So that's definitely things that I liked about it. Unfortunately, the things that I didn't like about it is a longer list. The biggest problem for me in the Book Eaters is that the themes are very on the nose. It definitely has vibes of Handmaid's Tale, but a more fantastical element. Consistently reiterates the fact that women are being fed fairy tales while men get to eat adventure stories and get a much better sense of the world. The women are very sheltered. They're basically like just used for breeding and creating children, because this group of book eaters does not reproduce very easily. I was having trouble coming up with that word. And so women are just used as broodmares, essentially. But my biggest problem, I don't have a problem with that premise necessarily. I just felt like the handling of it was very on the nose. It was very repetitive and strong, and if you love those themes, you might still enjoy this. But for me, that was too much. I wanted a more subtle exploration of patriarchy and misogyny, because it's not just like constant oppression. Like there's so much more to explore with that, and I have a hard time with stories that are too on the nose in terms of their theming, as you may have noticed from some of the other ones that I talked about already. So it just really didn't work very well for me. Again, I don't think that it's one that is going to work poorly for everyone. It's just not to my particular taste, and I feel like it could have been handled in a more subtle way with a stronger emphasis on the magic, and I would have enjoyed it a lot more. I'll also say, as a very character-driven reader, I don't think that any of the characters beyond Devon are very fleshed out, and I had trouble, even though I know that there's some revelation with Devon's son that kind of give reasons for him not really feeling like a normal kid or feeling like his own character. But it still wasn't really enough for me. I wanted to feel more like I could see him as a full-fledged character and less like he was a thematic exploration of things. So it just didn't feel completely fleshed out to me, and that's the other spot where it just wasn't my particular cup of tea. I was reading this with one of my friends, Jess, who did end up DNFing this one. I felt pretty similarly, but I was pretty determined to just make my way through anyway. So I've definitely heard mixed reviews on this. I think if the themes work for you and you're not a super character-driven reader, or you really identify with Devon, then this would work a lot better for you than it did for me. Step number 3 is to gather companions for help along the way. And for this one, I have 2 books. The first book fit the prompts for has romance and also the prompts for featuring family. And that was A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland. This one, just to show off my pretty copy because I'm in love with this copy. This is the broken binding copy of this book with the super pretty paisley edges and then the paisley foiling on the front there. And this one is a fantasy romance. Premise for this one is that the younger brother of a queen ends up sort of causing a misunderstanding in the royal family and has to win back the trust of his older sister. He does that by investigating a conspiracy that might threaten the safety and the security of their nation. And he is helped in this task by a new bodyguard who doesn't necessarily like him all that much at the beginning. So you really get to see the Prince Kadu try and investigate this conspiracy. Kadu suffers from anxiety, and because it's not in this fantasy setting, it's not necessarily very well known or accepted. He really views himself as a coward who should be better than he is, and he's just constantly struggling with the pressures of being in the royal family and needing to be an ambassador and just all of the things that go along with that, and not wanting to disappoint his sister. What I really loved about this story is it is very slow burn, and you really get to know the two main characters as well as a lot of the side characters. So Kadu, like I said, really struggles with anxiety. I really identified with him as someone who does deal with social anxiety. His is to the extent of panic attacks, and mine is not that bad, thankfully. But I just could really feel for him because it was so clear that he was not a coward, but he couldn't really see that himself. And as his bodyguard, Evermer, got to know him, you could really see that transition from judging Kadu's behaviors to really understanding them and having sympathy for them. You really get to see Evermer grow as a person because he is a recently graduated cadet from this bodyguard academy. He has very strong ideas about how things should be, and he actually reminded me a fair amount of Ali from the Devabad. I've only read, I haven't even finished the first book of that, but in a similar vein of having a defined idea of how things should be, being pretty idealistic and straight-laced. And so I had a little bit of a hard time with Evermer at first in terms of just liking him. Like, I think he's written well. I just struggled to really get along with him because he was being so straight-laced, and it was like, come on, dude, unbend a little. But you do get to see that transition, and I think that's what really makes this shine. If you have the patience for a very slow burn romance, then I think this really does give you that arc of the characters getting to know each other and falling in love in a way that doesn't feel too haphazard or too quick. So you do get to see that. It is pretty chunky, so you do have to have patience for that journey. But I ended up really enjoying it way more than I thought I would, because I used to consider myself not a fan of political fantasy, and this is basically political fantasy meets slow burn romance. So I will say also, if you are looking for a steamy queer romance, this is probably not going to fit the bill for you because there's very little steam. I think there's a couple scenes in there, but it's really more about the developing the relationship and like the friendship to something more type arc than it is about the steamy scenes. So just know that going in, because I think if you go in for steam, you might be a little disappointed. I also really enjoyed the world building that was in here. It has a very strong vibe of like Constantinople. There's some countries that reminded me very heavily of Greece in the height of its power. So it definitely has historical vibes, but in a very fantasy setting, but pretty light on the actual magic. It's almost more like alternate history. The other thing that I really enjoyed in this is, like I said, you get to see some of the side characters, and you get a lot of different representations of female power. Between the queen, who is a very strong but fair ruler, who kind of deals with her own problems and trying to navigate her younger brother not getting along with the father of her child, and all of these other situations that are happening. There's an advisor who is also a warrior, which was really interesting to see. And then there's another fun character who is just strong in terms of her relationship with her son. And you really get to see that blossom. So I felt like there was such a wide spread of what female strength was represented as, which I really appreciate seeing. As far as stuff that didn't work as well for me, I think the main struggle I had with this one was that the conspiracy that's supposed to be at the heart of this, and that kind of drew me in, to be honest, it takes a back seat to the relationships. And so it was a little disappointing to me, especially in the way that it was wrapped up. I felt like was a little lackluster and definitely was not in the spotlight. It's pretty clear early on who the villains are. So I didn't love that part as much, because it felt like if you're going to have a conspiracy, it should feel more secret. For me, that was just like, I didn't love the conspiracy, but I enjoyed the characters so much that I didn't really mind that much, and I still ended up giving this 4.5 stars. I would definitely consider this a favorite of the year and a favorite of the month. The other prompt that I completed for this step is a new to you author, and you got bonus points if it was a debut author. And for that, I read Leech by Hiron Ennes. This is a sort of gothic horror that has very strong vibes from The Thing, if you've seen that movie. The basic premise is that doctors and all medical personnel have been co-opted by what's known as the Interprovincial Medical Institute, and they send out doctors to whoever needs them, mostly the rich. And the goal of the institute is basically to take care of humanity for them, because they can't be trusted to do it themselves. The story begins with one of the doctors suddenly dying on a remote estate in the countryside, and the institute sends out another doctor to find out what happened, because the institute is connected to all of the doctors, but there's basically this blank spot where this doctor died, so they need to know what happened. And when the doctor gets to this estate, they find out that basically there's a new competitor for the bodies and minds of humanity. You get this very atmospheric, very creepy story as the doctor starts to investigate. And as his writing style is somewhat difficult to get into at the very beginning, because the doctor essentially represents a hive mind, you have this very formal, very sort of withdrawn perspective. And so you don't get a lot of character growth from the doctor in at least the first half. It can also be difficult to get used to the writing style being this very formal tone, and as also does not hold your hand in terms of the world building. There are pieces revealed as you go, but you're not even sure what time period this takes place in until well into the book. So it really works better for readers who enjoy solving the puzzle as they go. So I think if you enjoy that element of like the locked tomb, I've heard Course of Dragons also has that, although I have not read that series yet. But I think it works better for readers who enjoy that, because otherwise I think it might be frustrating or kind of dense, of a sort of dense read without that enjoyment of the puzzle. So I think one of the main appeals for this story is the thematic exploration of identity, responsibility, and autonomy. I don't want to get into specific details because I think that might be spoilery, but I think Ennes does a spectacular job of exploring this through the viewpoint of someone who is part of this greater institute and is almost subsumed by it. If you can enjoy that sort of thematic exploration, a very slow pace, very slow burn, creeping horror type story, I think you might really enjoy this. I will say I shouldn't say substantial. There's the biggest horror element of this is body horror. And it is detailed in parts, although not super gruesome. Like, it's not at the level of a Clive Barker, but it is definitely present. If you are super squeamish, you might have an issue with it. I tend to be fairly squeamish on body horror, and I was okay because the parts where there's body horror are usually intense but limited. So it wasn't too stomach turning for me, but your mileage may definitely vary on that. Overall, this is definitely a new fave for me. It got 4.5 stars from me. Again, was another favorite from this month, and I'm sure is going to end up being on my favorites of the year. I really loved the thematic exploration and the puzzle of it. I think if you are a super character-driven reader, you might not have patience for the more withdrawn style of it. But for me, I just absolutely loved the puzzle of this and how much it really delivered on the vibes of the Thing comp that I constantly saw for this. So definitely one I loved. Step number 4 was the actual quest for the apple tree. And for that, I read for the prompts has magic and has a historical setting. And for that, I did a reread of A Marvellous Light by Freya Marske. I'm trying to do that in a way that's not super shiny. And this is the Illumicrate copy of the book, in case anyone's wondering, since it looks weird. A Marvellous Light I read earlier this year when I got it from Illumicrate. I love this. It is a gas lamp fantasy romance set in an Edwardian time period where you have a young nobleman named Robin Blythe who ends up being put into a post as a liaison to the magical society in England. And that society is very secret. He had no idea that this even existed, and he wasn't necessarily supposed to because the posting had previously been given to someone who actually knew the society, but was still part of the human world. And Robin basically has to work with the magical counterpart, liaison, who is Edwin Corsi, to find out what happened to his predecessor. And sort of ends up unraveling this greater mystery that ends up dragging him into a fair amount of danger. What really worked for me in this is the romance and the characters. So, as you might expect for a fantasy romance, it's pretty character driven. I loved Robin. He's this sort of himbo, athletic, young lord who's just trying to do the best for his sister, who's all he has left of his family, and really cares about helping out the people that he loves, but is pretty lost at sea when it comes to the magical elements that he's dealing with, since that is something he's never been aware of before. And then you have Edwin, who's this bookish guy who really just wants to be left alone in the library to be dealing with his own things. He's got past trauma from a frankly awful family upbringing. He's definitely looked down upon by his family because he has limited magical abilities in comparison to the more powerful people in his family, and that's really seen as a detriment, and why he is the magical liaison, because he isn't seen as being much good for anything else. So you have very prickly Edwin getting to know very gregarious Robin, and I really loved getting to see them get to know each other, getting over their initial dislike of each other because they are very different people. I think that the romance was handled in a way that really made sense to me because they they're in a time period where it's not acceptable to be queer. They have to hide their feelings for each other, not only at the beginning from each other because they don't want to reveal themselves, but also from society at large. And I will say that one of the things I tend to be frustrated by in romances is there's a very predictable third act breakup. And I think that the conflict in this book is so much more believable and does not feel contrived in the way that has frustrated me in romances in the past, where it's like, oh, we gotta check that box now. This felt more like, yeah, that would be a problem. Like, of course, I understand why this would drive a wedge between them. The magic system that's in here, I would say, it takes more of a backseat to the romance. It's a pretty soft magic system. I was intrigued by it, but I think that it doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody feels like they got enough of that in the story. So, again, your mileage may vary as far as how much you enjoy that side of things. The last piece that I will say about A Marvellous Light is that, in contrast to A Taste of Gold and Iron, there are incredibly steamy scenes in A Marvellous Light. Like, more explicit than I think I've seen in any other fantasy romance that I've picked up, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Just go in knowing that it's very steamy. And again, overall, I loved this just as much the second time that I read it. It is a favorite of the year. I just really enjoy getting to know these characters and seeing them fall in love. It just really brought so much joy to my heart for them to find each other when they really needed to. So it's just a very heartwarming story for me that still has a lot of stakes to it. So, highly recommend this one if you like fantasy romance. Finally, on to the final step, which, like I said, I did not end up completing. This final step was to actually climb the apple tree and acquire fruit. So I guess I made my way to the apple tree and then stopped. I just had a picnic or something. So, the book that I did not quite finish in November, but did finish in December, is Little Thieves by Margaret Owen. And Jessie at the Bookish Mom had said that she thought I would really enjoy this. 100% correct. I loved this. Easiest 5 stars of the month. It's funny because I think I've seen some mixed reviews for this, but this had everything that I wanted in it. It is a retelling of the Goose Girl from the villain's perspective, except that she really expands on the story. And so the main character, Vanya, was the maid to a princess, and the princess had a magical necklace that would basically allow her to sort of be prettier, like a prettier version of herself. And Vanya steals this necklace, takes on the identity of the princess, and the princess is left destitute. And Vanya uses this ability to appear as the princess to basically live a double life, as pretending to be the princess and dealing with the princess's fiancé, who is a bit of a piece of work, and using that access to these higher social circles to steal jewels from the wealthy and try and fund her escape. And the main reason she needs to escape is because she is the adopted daughter of Death and Fortune, and she will have to choose who to serve between them unless she makes her escape from this country that she lives in. In addition to that, she's also cursed by an angry god because of her greed, and is told that she has 2 weeks to break the curse, or she will turn into jewels herself. Like, all of her will turn into jewels. And so she is both trying to finish out her funding of her escape attempt, as well as break the curse, all while she's being accompanied by the daughter of the god who cursed her, who's supposed to keep an eye on her, and a junior detective has basically been brought in to find out who is perpetrating all these thefts. So it's this very heisty, extremely snarky romp with a very prickly main character. It does not make any bones about the fact that Vanya is out for herself. She wants to escape. She wants to do the things necessary so that she can live a decent life and not be stuck as she was stuck as a maid or in terms of serving the gods who raised her. She's got a lot of trauma related to that because she had a very poor upbringing and was mistreated by the family that she served as a maid for. So it was really interesting to see Owen explore this idea of the choices that are left to you when you don't have wealth or social standing to back you up, and sort of the dangers of trying to occupy a space where even wealthy women have limited choices in what they can do. It also has a very atmospheric Germanic setting. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where this is, but there were definitely German terms. There's a glossary in here if you're not familiar with it, as I wasn't. So I really liked that. I think it's a good winter read because it is so atmospheric and it just feels wintry in a lot of places. And this might be a little bit of a hot take because I've seen a lot of people who don't like the romance that's in here, but I actually really liked it. I thought it handled the idea of consent and of like different power levels really well. I just really enjoyed a lot of the characters in here. There was one romance that felt like not tacked on, but I didn't feel like I got as much from it as I wanted. But I loved these characters so much that I honestly I am excited that there is a sequel that's coming to this next year because I just want to spend more time with them. I will say the one thing that didn't work as well for me is the ending felt a little bit too neat as far as being wrapped up very quickly and stretching believability a little bit, which is a weird thing to say when you're talking about gods in a fantasy setting, but for me it was a little bit like, okay, fine. I enjoyed the humor so much that I am more than willing to overlook an ending that doesn't quite hit the way I necessarily would want it to, but overall, I absolutely loved this. I can't wait to read more from Margaret Owen because this just worked so well for me in terms of a heist that's like funny but also has some serious subject matter and characters that I can just really dig into. So absolutely another favorite of the month, likely a favorite of the year. This was such a great read and I'm so glad I got to buddy read this with Jess because we had such a fun time with it. So that was my reading in the month of November for the Once Upon a Readathon. Readathon? I had a great time. Many thanks to Hannah for organizing all of this, all of the co-hosts. The co-hosts for my team were Sarah from Sarah Reads and Maria from Maria Might Read That. And I really appreciate all the work that they put in. It was a fantastic readathon, and even though I didn't love every single book that I picked up, overall, I found new favorites for the year from this stack, so I could not be happier. Let me know if you have read any of these. Let me know what you read in November, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye!